All right, welcome back everybody to On the Ball, the video podcast series from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm really excited to have Carl Sudler with us today from Emory University, where he's an associate professor, among other things, teaches sport history there. And Carl, you're somebody I feel like we've never met in person, but you're a social media friend of mine. I would say, I see what you're up to on Twitter, and really grateful to have this chance to talk to you today. So thank you.
Yeah. Likewise, Andrew. Again, it's as somebody that still feels like I'm entering the sports history space, I'm always excited to have these types of chances. And like you, I feel like I've known you for a while, even though this is the first time we've had the chance to meet and meet face to face. But yeah.
Yeah, well, one of the things I wanted to ask you, since we're just, getting to know each other, is like, where are you from, and who are your teams growing up from a sports standpoint?
Yeah, originally from New York City, but my father is a military guy, so we moved a lot as a kid. And so I like to tell, I share this with my students regularly. So I'm a fan of all teams New York except for basketball. I'm actually a Lakers fan. And because basketball is like my main sport, I tend to pick up that identity of being a Lakers fan more so than anything. And
Hmm.
that happened. I might have shared this story before, but or in different capacity. But I became a Lakers fan and lost my Knicks allegiance as a very young kid who, on
Was just
part,
this
was living.
because the Knicks weren't any good and the Lakers were, or more to it than
No, no, no. I
that?
actually I actually become a Laker fan at an awkward Lakers phase. That is like in between like the Magic days and the like Kobe and Shaq days, right?
Okay.
And part of it was my dad was stationed in Honolulu in Hawaii at the time, and so the sheer time zone difference as a kid didn't really allow me to watch East Coast games.
Yeah.
And most of my classmates, I was going to school in Hawaii, elementary school in Hawaii. A lot of them were Lakers fans, so that kind of rubbed off there. And then there's another part of this story that Patrick Ewing. I had asked him for an autograph as a kid when he was out about with his family in Atlantic City, and he told me, not right now. I'm just trying to spend some time with my family. And
Hmm.
I remember like feeling gutted that Patrick Ewing, didn't sign an autograph for me. And I've yet to ask another athlete for an autograph after that.
Yeah.
But also now in hindsight, I like to thank Patrick Ewing for saving me the life of a Knicks fan. And and one that is a Laker fan. But otherwise, it's like I'm a Yankees guy. It was a Giants over Jets family and stuff like that. So but
Okay.
yeah.
Good stuff. Well, I grew up in DC, so I'm old enough that Patrick Ewing was playing for Georgetown when I was a little kid, and my dad got us season tickets his freshman year, so I got to see that team many times. Never asked him for his autograph though. I'm originally from Wisconsin, so I'm Brewers, Packers, Bucks fan. We went to spring training a lot to see the Brewers, and a pitcher that had played for them briefly and then was on the Cardinals named Dave LaPointe, who is not a
Mm.
star, was asking for his autograph. And I told him when I was like 10 years old that I liked him better when he was on the Brewers. And uh, he called me a knucklehead. So that's my embarrassing autograph story.
Yeah.
um,
Thank God for camera phones that now kind of have moved us away from the day of
yeah,
autograph
yeah.
asking in public. Yeah.
Just get the picture. Yeah.
Right.
And so were you a kid that was purely into the sports aspect? Were you also aware of athletes, being having the potential to be activists or speaking out on issues? Was there an athlete as you were growing up that you admired for reasons beyond what they did on the court or the field?
Yeah. So both. I don't want to pretend like I was a kid that was, completely invested in, what athletes were doing, in the community. Again, and this is coming from somebody who grew up, moving from military base to military base, where, athletes would often come to town, via like USOs or different kind of programs, to just kind of do events, for the troops, right, in
Right.
different kinds of capacities. Um, but but really, I turned to sports, from like a cultural kind of perspective. as a kid, I think more than anything, especially as a kid that often found himself living in some interesting places. Like I lived in Fort Knox, Kentucky, lived in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, lived in Hawaii, lived in but my familial roots were always in the Bronx. And so
Hmm.
you know, basketball was always huge for me. And so, you know, and I played what, you know, I was never blessed with height. I'm a smooth 5'9" with shoes on, and so you know, but it was something that you know I was also one of those kids that constantly like walked around just dribbling a basketball, and so sports meant you know was you know more of a pastime that kind of like kept me you know in a weird way feeling culturally connected um to communities. You know, I played in
Hmm.
various little leagues. You know, I played soccer for a season as a kid. I played football for a couple of seasons as a kid, and but basketball was always kind of like you know like my joy. Um, and in terms of like, if I had to kind of like identify an athlete who I really started becoming kind of invested in young, kind of like outside of I would have to like in a weird way, and he wasn't really the most like politically active, but it was just you know just kind of seeing his growth. I always tell people like I grew up with like Kobe.
Hmm.
You know, I was a Lakers fan again, like before Kobe got there. I was I had to be well, Kobe gets drafted in '96, so I was 10 when Kobe got drafted, and I remember being a 10-year-old GM of the Lakers who was really upset that we traded Vlade Divac for the rights to this high school kid. Um, but then, you know, I spent the next 20 years of my life with him as kind of like the centerpiece of my favorite sports team. So he was probably the first athlete who I got invested in really kind of like knowing off the court. Uh,
Hmm.
you know, and I like to remind my students we didn't have 24-hour access to athletes the way, you know, that some of them feel now. And so it just required a different kind of work. But like whenever Kobe was in a magazine, I would grab it, right? I'm a big sneaker person. You know, I wear
Okay.
sneakers all the time.
Hmm.
So I remember like Kobe, you know, originally an Adidas guy who then jumps over to Nike, and I remember like just making sure I had like the latest Kobe's from like the Crazy Eights with Adidas and you know forward. And so it was so I think like for me thinking about getting to know athletes off the field or outside the court really was partially out of like a fandom around Kobe. And then as like my love for history grew, I really started kind of getting into the books and you know diving in. And so I think like if I had to share an athlete story, and I actually write about this in my first book, who kind of like turned my eye to sports in a more critical kind of way, it would actually be Reuben Hurricane Carter,
Oh, really?
uh,
Okay.
the boxer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Huh. From watching the movie, or had you read about him?
both. So I was in high school when the movie came out, and I was so enamored by the idea again, and I wasn't using this kind of language, but just kind of reflecting on it. I was so enamored by the idea of like a wrongful conviction
Yeah.
and having this kind of impact. And so I remember seeing the movie and like running to the library to like check out the book. You know, shout out to all public libraries who
Yeah.
still do a lot of this work. But I remember getting the book and you know I sat with the book, his book, you know, read it over the weekend. Came into class like I had a really good freshman um, history teacher in high school. And he was, I think, my homeroom teacher the year the movie comes out. But he would always just ask, like, what did people do on the weekends? And I told him, I was just like, man, I read this book. And I watched this movie and then I read this book about Hurricane Carter. Can't believe this guy sat in prison for this long and people knew he was innocent. And he was like,
Hmm.
but how do you know? I remember him asking, like, how do you know he's innocent? And I was like, I mean, for me, I was like, it's in a nonfiction book, right? It was as simple as that, right? Like it was just like it was a book and it was real, like it wasn't fiction. Like, and he was, and so, but I remember him pushing me and being like, "Well, who wrote the book?" And I was like, "He did." And so he asked, and he was just like, "Well, do you think if he was sitting in prison writing a book that he would write one where he would proclaim his guilt or proclaim his innocence?" And
Hmm.
from that point forward, like I share that story as somebody who then goes on to write a book about issues of crime and criminality. was always just like the narrative had so much power, right? That the narrative could dictate whether somebody was innocent or guilty, regardless of what actually, actually
Okay.
occurred. And
Yeah.
so, it was actually through sport that I actually get invested in, broader kind of carceral state kind of histories and stuff as well, because of Reuben Carter. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I was going to ask you about this later, but since we're on the
Uh,
carceral state and sports, you're working on a book, is that right? No Way Out: The Carceral Boundaries of Race and Sports. It sounds fascinating. What can you tell us about, what you're writing about in that book?
Yeah, so I'm really kind of invested in this long history of how the police and the police state writ large have kind of invested in organized or colluded in organized sporting spaces. And so it's a long history that starts in actually in the 1850s, which is well outside of, the purview of my first book. And it comes up through today. And, just looking at these different kind of high points in which we see kind of again like police and organized sport kind of collusion and or police state and organized sport kind of collusion. So I look at kind of like early histories of like black YMCA's and stuff. So it's partially why it starts in 1850s is the first black YMCA's Washington DC, right? It opens
Okay.
up in 1853. um I moved through like black baseball chapters, but also kind of looking at what what the rise of black baseball and prison baseball kind of look like side by side. um, so I, dig into stories like Satchel Pages, who, credits his time as being a juvenile, locked up in a juvenile correctional facility in Mount Meigs, Alabama, with kind of finding his like skills, right, and love for the game.
Mm-hmm.
But also like guys like Roy Tyler, who were generally like, or who were paroled from the Negro, from prison into the Negro Leagues. So some of the early stuff looked at that, but then, I really dive in to different high points in like carceral state history, whether it's like the war on drugs and what the war on drugs meant for Black athletes and surveillance of Black communities through sports.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I look at, midnight basketball programs that kind of hop up and what this kind of like collusion between the state and organized sport looks like and how it's experienced. We just brought midnight basketball back in
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta recently. Um, and so yeah, so it's a book that I'm having a lot of fun writing. It's one of the books that, as my agent once told me, like once you see these connections, it's really difficult to unsee
Okay.
them.
Yeah.
And some of the stories, that I've had the chance to kind of piece together and work together are some that, sometimes my students blame me for ruining sports for them. But I tell them, I love sports, right? Like I find myself James Baldwin-esque in the sense of like, it's my love for sports that reserves the right to criticize it,
Absolutely.
in the way that I do. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that. And it sounds like a fascinating book. I'm curious, one of the like chips on my shoulder that I've had over the years is just the feeling you get from some corners of academia that like sports is not quite a worthy like area to study, or and it seems so like mistaken to me. Like it's to me it's like what a beautiful platform to tell so many stories about history and human nature and race and every political issue you can think of. Like, have you run into that over the course of your career? Have you seen things change in the esteem that sports studies are held, or like what's the state right now?
Absolutely. I think, the sports study scholars, ahead of me have actually done a lot of the legwork that allow, folks like us who are writing about it today to kind of like build on. Um, but I do think, it's still somewhat of an uphill fight. I often, now that so I teach a sports history class at Emory, and I teach it every spring because I tie it around a annual sports history program that I host here. But I always start the class with just general like state of the fields, right? So I rely on like Amy Bass's State of the Field that she wrote for the JAH, but also Amira Rose Davis's new one in the Journal of African American History.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my students and I just have the conversation like, what is it about sports as sort of this cultural lens that still warrants this like, but it's sports, right? Like, we don't have it with in the same kind of way with art or music or or
Hmm.
film or dance or like you name it, right? Like we're at a point where all of these things have their own departments, right?
Right.
In academia, but there's still something about sports, right? That kind of warrants less. And I think by the end of the semester, I think students kind of understand, this notion of sort of, brawn over brain that applies in sports that often kind of keeps sport relegated, or at least that's where they tend to settle. That keeps sports relegated to like the margins of academia, right? That it's something that people who are physically talented can do, and as a result, like it's less intellectually kind of gratifying that these other kind of cultural forms.
Hmm.
Though I try to, push back against that. I often find myself like having that fight in my classes still in 2024. So while I
Okay.
think it changes, I think, most students show up thinking, oh, it's a sports history class. This should be an easy A. And then they get hit with like state of the fields and theory articles right off the back. And they're just like, what are we doing in here? So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, with you and so many other brilliant scholars out there, hopefully there's a new generation of college students that are learning a different way of viewing sports, and will be the leaders in the next generation. So you mentioned the spring speaker series or program that you have at Emory, and I know that you recently hosted that event with John Carlos,
Yeah. Yeah.
one of the like OGs of everything we're talking about. Had you ever met him before? What was it like just to be in his presence? Before we talk about what you all talked about, but just I imagine that must have been a really exciting opportunity for you.
It was, and I hadn't met him before. We had a couple of phone conversations leading up to the program. He is local to the Atlanta area, so he lives pretty close here, um, or not too far from campus. And so but there was also this moment where we had arranged a driver to pick him up, and when his driver like he gets out the car, that it just kind of hits you of sort of like, oh, like this is really happening. And and we spent a good amount of time together. So as part of like even beyond the kind of the public program was about 75 minutes. um we spent time in the archive, showed them some of the documents that we have in the African American and Sports collection up at the Rose Library. We filmed some content up there. We had the public portion of the program, had a brief meet and greet with some student athletes on campus after the public portion of the program. Then we went to dinner, and we were at dinner till to nearly 10 o'clock at night. So it became like this, like, he arrived at campus at 3, and, I walked him to his car at, almost 10 o'clock. And, I walked away from that moment thinking, wow, I just spent 7 hours of a day with, the John Carlos.
Yeah,
So it was nice.
that's amazing. I mean, I had a chance to meet Harry Edwards when he was here a couple of years ago. Didn't spend more than 10 minutes with him, but just his presence as a figure, but then his physical presence too was just really impressive, and something I'll never forget. So when you're talking to John Carlos, obviously, you've read, studied the 1968 Olympics and the protest with Tommy Smith. Were there things that he said that put a little bit of a different spin, or were new things that you had not really heard before or considered before in his story?
Yeah, so I jokingly opened up our conversation. So I had a Philadelphia-based artist, Chuck Styles, who had this like really fascinating or really good painting of kind of various Olympic athletes. So it was like Jesse Owens, FloJo, but then it was like the Olympic podium. So I wore it on my T-shirt, and I had a blazer on top of the T-shirt. So I jokingly, opened a conversation with, "Has anybody ever interviewed you in public while wearing you on their shirt?" Um, and he was like, "You're not the first one." But I tried to actually frame much of the conversation. In his book that in his memoir with Dave Zirin, he talks about how so many of his African American historical heroes, right, whether it's Malcolm or Paul Robeson or Muhammad Ali, they tend to get frozen in these kind of what he called like postage stamps. Um, so I actually like geared or tried to gear the conversation of like, this has also happened to you, right? That
Yeah.
that you in many ways have been kind of like frozen in this moment. And so we spent a good amount of time talking about who John Carlos was before 68. Um, as a kid who grew up in Harlem, who had access to kind of like this vibrant culture. He was sharing stories about living close to the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom and these kinds of venues. He was sharing, some of these stories are in the book, right? He was sharing stories about how he learned he was fast because he was running from the police after like stealing, off of like freight trains and stuff like that, and giving food back into the communities. Um, so we talked a lot about those kinds of stories. We also talked a good bit about, he really was adamant that, he went to 68, like, a lot of the conversation, that we've read about, studied about is like, the 68 protest becomes kind of a compromise after the calling off of the boycott.
Mhm.
But he did share that, he was still one of the few in like the boycott camp, or at least felt like it was something that he still should have boycotted and stayed away from. But that if he went to 68, he needed to get to the medal stand, right? Not that he cared any bit about the medal, but that he needed that platform to demonstrate.
Mhm.
And so hearing him frame it in that way was, was important, I think, not only for me to hear, but also, for people in the audience, because, like I know there was just a lot of contestation about like, whether it should boycott or stay away from Mexico City and whatnot. And so his like logic of like, well, if we're going, we need these medals, right? Because if we
Mhm.
don't get on the stand, we can't kind of have these moments. So that I thought was really striking to hear. And then we talked a lot about, what it means for athletes today to have skin in the game. And he has some very vibrant kind of points and insights, and he thinks a lot about how the media kind of can like pick and choose the athletes who they want to build up. um he talks about like how different that was in his day. Not that the media didn't have the power to pull down, but he was
Right.
just actually thinking about the media as choosing athletes to build up. Was something that he was pretty adamant about, thinking about the athletes who kind of speak for the generation today.
Mhm.
And so yeah, it was a really fun conversation.
I can imagine. And then the other thing that I saw on Twitter was, and I love the fact that you called it your Forrest Gump moment. But you had a chance to speak at an event in England about racism, sexism in soccer. And, so thinking about the connections between the past, although John Carlos is still with us, but, thinking about the 60s and then what athletes are dealing with today. And, he knew that he needed to get up on that platform, for a medal to be heard. Athletes now have platforms at their fingertips. So things have changed. But tell us about that event in England, and why'd you call it
Yeah.
your Forrest Gump moment?
So I was invited to basically a summit, right? I think they refer to it as like a landmark conference, which was sponsored by, or funded by, I should say, the owner of the Nottingham Forest Premier League European Football Club. And it was co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center at Harvard, and who I've been working with for a couple of years now, especially with Steve Ortega, and Lilian Thuram Foundation. And Lilian was there, and he's been pretty vocal about speaking about what it means as a Black European soccer player, especially in post-playing days. And so he was sort of central to organizing the who's who, um, of soccer player who was there, right? That wasn't necessarily just associated with Nottingham Forest.
Okay.
So a bunch of players from Nottingham were there, but there were also legends, right? Christian Crombo, Thierry Henry, Olivier Decourt, like, and all of these guys showed up because Lilian invited them, right? And he was sort of that like central kind of figure to organizing. Um, and so I was invited out, and I spoke on a panel that was three historians. It was myself, it was Hassan Jeffries from Ohio State, and Jeff Gonda, who's at Syracuse. And basically, the front of it was, and there were two non-historians. There was a filmmaker and Kendra Kennedy, and Justin Morrow, who was a retired MLS player, but he was the founder of Black Players for Change, which was a organizing soccer body, independent soccer body that organized like the Black players post George Floyd into MLS and women's professional soccer here in the States. And and so we were invited out to talk about athlete activism in the States and how athletes, both in the past and in the contemporary period, kind of have, used their, to your point, right, use their platforms um, to become activists, but to really kind of see some sort of like substantive change in their generations. And and so there was a part of me, and I shared this recently in an interview about it. But there was a part of me that showed up with like my talking points of like, all right, I'm gonna borrow Harry Edwards's ways of activism, and I'm gonna
Hmm.
give this kind of like historical lesson. And then I got there, and I was genuinely surprised, and perhaps I shouldn't have been because folks like Thierry Henry can't go anywhere in Europe and not have a massive audience. But I was genuinely surprised when I walked in the room and it was like every media outlet in the UK, and it was just, it was a standing room only. And I was like, whoa, like this is a big
Okay.
deal.
Uh-huh.
And so it just kind of pivoted on my feet. And I still kind of thought about the frameworks of that, Dr. Edwards has laid out in his work, but really just was moved by earlier conversations that athletes, or earlier comments that athletes have made in the room about fear, and the fear of reprisal, and the fear and like the consequences of if they speak out and how they speak out. And for context, this meeting ended up happening about a week after Matt Mignon from AC Milan had just kind of run into a racist incident on the pitch, right? Goalkeeper for AC Milan, who people in the audience were making monkey noises and
Hmm.
whatnot at him, and so he walked off the pitch, right? And so the context is like this had just happened in the European soccer world, and now this meeting was about to happen, and so a lot of the players have voiced kind of, at least the current players have voiced like, the fear of reprisal on if they were to stick up for, and stand out and do something more direct to address these kinds of incidences. And and so I just kind of pivoted on my feet and really used my comments to talk about like, even the history of Black athlete activism is that kind of fear has always been present, if not motivating. Um,
Hmm.
and to think through and became like a sounding board for the athletes in the room on how that fear could potentially motivate them to act out, right, or to respond, and to be open with their ownership and team ownership to hold people accountable, when these types of incidents do happen. And so after our panel, so this is the Forrest Gump moment. After our panel, Lilian Thuram came to the stage to give some remarks, and they invited every player, both former and current, to the stage. And so this became like a viral kind of moment of a photograph. So all of the panelists had at that point stepped off the stage, and I had stepped off, but realized I left my iPad on the stage. And so I go back to get my iPad, and but they're like positioning themselves for this picture. And Christian Krambo, former, footballer for Paris national club, he's now coach with Olympiacos in Greece. And but he like puts his arm on my shoulder. He's like, no, 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 you can stay. And I was like, no, I'm not a player. And and he's just like, no, but no need to have fear. And I was like, no, no, I'm like not afraid. I actually speak about these things regularly. But I'm just not a player. He was like, it's fine, it's fine. And so like there's like this picture that came out of the meeting. Um, and in some ways I like to think like, should the change that they're hoping for be spearheaded, we're gonna look at this picture like, 67 Cleveland Summit, right? Or
That's
something
right.
like wild. And they're gonna be like, who's that non-footballer at the end? And it's me with Christian Crombo with his hand on my shoulder. And you can actually still see my iPad sitting in the chair right behind me, and it's just so I called it my Forrest Gump moment because I was like, I totally shouldn't be in this picture, but somehow I ended up in it.
That's fantastic. Wow. Yeah, I think about that fear issue you mentioned, and you know, my first book was a biography of Perry Wallace, who was the first black basketball player in the SEC, and he told me that he was concerned he might get shot and killed stepping onto the basketball court in Starkville or Oxford. But really, I think the most courageous thing he ever did was just tell the truth about his experience. You know, even though he knew a lot of people in Nashville didn't want to hear the truth. And after his last game, he talked about the racism he encountered on the road, but the more profound thing for him was the loneliness he felt on his own campus. You know, and that other side of the coin of racism, that was the isolation, being the most difficult part. And he said he had a moral obligation as a pioneer to tell the truth about that, even if it meant writing his ticket out of town, is the way he put it. That, you know, he'd be run out of town for telling the truth.
Yeah.
So when you talk to these athletes now, and they talk about the cost of activism or the fears associated with it, like you can see, or maybe, you know, cost Colin Kaepernick his career in the NFL. On the other hand, you see athletes who are outspoken. Even Cap has Nike endorsements. I mean, it's like it can cost you in some ways, it can benefit you in others. You know, what have you learned about the way athletes think about whether they should use this opportunity or not?
Yeah, I actually point to Cap, and so I talk a little bit about Kaepernick in the book, not a ton, but but my framing of Cap is like, like his freedom after playing, right after being blackballed from the league, um, it seems to be so much more profound, right? The work he
Right.
continues to do with Know Your Rights, right? He has this, book deal, these, multi-book deals that he's publishing books on like police abolition and, doing kids books and teen books and YA books. And, he did that documentary on police brutality in Bakersfield, California. Like, there's an element of me who's like, man, like Cap, like in a weird way, unfortunately, because of the constraints of the league, if Cap was still playing, potentially we have none of this stuff,
Right.
right?
Right. Mhm.
Including, like the way in which he utilizes Nike support for particular kind of collaborations, right? His most recent kind of drop was a T-shirt where he had like the drawings of a young person from the community, right? And so I think a lot about just the freedom from the confine of the league, right? The freedom
Right.
from the shield actually kind of created that kind of space for him. The unfortunate part of that story is, anybody who's talked with athletes notice is like, you know, that he had to lose what meant arguably the most to him in the games that he loved the most, right?
Mhm.
And that these two things kind of couldn't go side by side. And but I think if anything, his skin in the game showed that there is this sort of other side, right?
Mhm.
That can potentially be open. And there's no guarantee. Like I think Kaepernick is an anomaly in that sense of thinking about like how he was able to fend at least financially, but also just keep a particular kind of platform. Because I mean, John Carlos shared the other kind of that story. Obviously, we're not in '68 anymore, but he talked about the struggles, especially financially, from
Mhm.
his decision. And so I think I think I try to like meet athletes where they are, realizing one that your athletic window is one that's not going to carry you into the end of your life, right? That there is this element of like needing to know what's next anyway. And that's if you have a long career or a short career. Like,
Mhm.
we have guys play 20 years pro and they're in their 40s and we're just like, well, what are you going to do now? Right?
Right.
Like, there's still this what are you going to do now kinds of moments. And, and I think it's just so important and something that really stuck with me that John Carlos said in his conversation was, it's important for athletes to kind of look in the mirror and be happy with who they are and their decisions that they can then make. Um, because that's going to be the person that's still staring back at them you know, when the jersey's off, right? Or
Yeah.
when the ball stops. And you know, and I think like you keep that center, then you live with the decisions and the choices that you make moving forward.
Mhm.
Whether that means utilizing your platform in particular ways or not, or thinking you're gonna come back to it or not. Like I think like you know, you have to be happy, you know, and content with the choices that you make, and not let fear be kind of that like deciding factor.
Yeah. Well, that's a really profound sentiment to, I think, wrap up this interview on, Carl. I know you have a busy day. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I'd love to talk to you more on the air or off, about all these issues. And since you're just down the road in Atlanta, hopefully there'll be a chance for us to welcome you to campus in Nashville someday in the not too distant future. But keep up the great work. Really looking forward to your book. And thanks again.
For sure. Thanks, Andrew, for having me.